Welcome, everybody, to the Tech Trailblazers Founders on Fire podcast. And today we are talking to Tim Heinrichs, who is the CTO and co-founder of Styra and one of the guys behind the Open Policy Agent, OPA, which has recently graduated within the CNCF. Hello, Tim. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Rose. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. So, we're just going to talk a little bit about how you came from academia through into the world of a big corporate and then out that other side into Styra and the formation of that. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that journey, Tim.
So back, I did my, as you say, my doctoral work at Stanford in computer science, but I focused on policy languages, declarative languages. Most people don't even know that's a thing that you can do, but yeah, that was what I focused on. And as you say, I worked as a postdoc for a number of years as well. But what also happened simultaneously was that one of Nicira's founders, remember Nicira was known for software-defined networking, for coining that term. So one of Nicira's founders and I knew each other at Stanford. And so as I was at the same time that I was doing my postdoc work, I was also working with him and Nicira in the early days, because in the early days of Nicira, it was really a company designed around the idea of a policy-based networking solution, right? You write some rules about, what packets can move around, and then the software goes ahead and implements and forces that automatically. So they needed a policy language, and that's what, obviously I've been studying for a number of years. Anyway, so I knew the Nicira folks back then, and then a few years later decided to go ahead and join back in with Nicira more formally, like leave academia and move into industry. And that was about the time that Nicira was acquired by VMware. And so that's how I ended up in VMware doing, working on the same kinds of problems that I've been working on forever. And then at VMware, it turns out that we were talking to a number of Nicira's clients at the time. They were financials and tech firms. And what they told us was that that they all had hundreds of thousands even of applications. And what they had to end up building was this sort of unified solution to policy for all their apps. That was just how they found that they had to manage authorization policy for all those apps. And so what they said was, could you go off and build, a solution, a unified solution of policy for us. And because they didn't want to do it. That wasn't their core competency, wasn't what they wanted to spend time on. And so anyway, then we started a project inside of OpenStack at the time. That was what Nicira was very comfortable in the open source world. And so we worked on that for a couple of years, but then we realized that this problem of unified policy, unified authorization was one that was going to be not just an OpenStack problem, not just a VMware problem. It was a problem that spanned all the different technologies that people are using, especially in this sort of cloud native world, this DevOps world, this microservice world. And so that's when we went ahead and started Styra. So that's kind of the founding story, I guess.
Fantastic. That sounds good. So, Tim, thanks for sharing that interesting journey, which was quite fortuitous, really, wasn't it? So coming through postdoctoral stuff, coming across Nicira, and then that obviously being acquired by VMware, and then you also finding this groundswell of interest in authorization. So that's great. So looking back at that, let's have a look at perhaps at the technology side of things. So you've talked a little bit of how you came up with the idea and what the push was from the users in your conversations while you guys were at VMware. So tell us about your co-founder and what you've been up to, because I understand that the technology is both an open source project, the open side of things, and then a commercial one. So could you just give us an insight into, who the founding team were and how you guys have been operating for the last 5 years?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the other co-founder, Teemu Koponen, he's got a great background in distributed systems. He was actually the chief architect at Nicira. And so what was great was that when we realized that we needed to start Styra, we knew from our past experience, technically speaking, what the requirements were on a solution for unified authorization. And so one piece, of course, was that we needed a policy language that allowed people to write down whatever policies they cared about. And that policy would have to work. That policy language would have to work for really any kind of piece of software, right? Whether it's like Kubernetes or microservices or an application, it didn't really matter. But the second thing that we knew we needed was a distributed architecture, a way of implementing and enforcing policy at a scale that could only be served through distribution and a decentralized architecture. And Timu's background is exactly that, right? He had a similar kind of journey as I did, which is he did his doctoral work in distributed systems. And so now, the two of us combined have all those technical, all that technical background we need to build out, obviously, a distributed authorization system. And so anyway, that's kind of how I like to think about it and how we got started down this technical road.
Cool. So that's that side of things. So do you want to tell us a little bit about OPA? Because that really was the beginning of the Styra journey, wasn't it? And obviously, and how that fits in with, maybe just give a quick overview for people, which I think would be interesting for myself as well, is, how does this all work when you have an open source thing that you donate to the CNCF or a similar, open source body?
Yeah. So the one thing to keep in mind here is that definition of the problem statement, right? The problem statement that we solve is authorization, right? So that's just really a fancy word for just saying, controlling the actions that people and machines are taking. Mm-hmm. And so that's the example I like to give there is, banking application. Anytime I log into a banking application, if I try to withdraw money, am I authorized to do that or not? Am I allowed to take that action or not? So the software needs to know the answer to that. It has to enforce it. And that's kind of the problem space that we're in. And then what we really focus on is really all of those software systems, solving that authorization problem for all those software systems that developers use to build and run their own software. So it's kind of a meta authorization problem. But anyway, so that's kind of the problem space. And then we built two pieces of software to address this. The first of which is this Open Policy Agent project. Its goal is to provide this unified language and tool set for expressing and enforcing policy across many different kinds of software. So that's really OPA's goal. And what we did when we started it was, we spent a couple of years developing it, making sure that we had a good and solid piece of software that people could use, and we had people using it. And then we eventually donated it to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And so the way that works is that when you donate it to the CNCF, you typically start out as what's called a sandbox level of maturity, and then it moves ahead to the incubating level, and then finally it moves along to the graduated level of maturity. And that's where OPA is. That's the same sort of that's the same level of maturity as Kubernetes, Prometheus, Envoy, some of these other very popular cloud native software systems. So that's kind of the journey for any project that's going into the CNCF.
So it's in good company then if it's with Prometheus and Kubernetes then in that case, because obviously they're very well recognized. So Tim, that's OPA, and that's the, your open source project, which has been shared with the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Could you tell us a little bit more about the commercial product that Styra has really been developing more over the last couple of years?
Yeah, great. So the commercial product that we have aims to operationalize OPA for the enterprise. So the way I always like to think about it is that OPA was sort of designed to be a distributed approach to authorization. So you might run not just 1 or 10, but maybe 100 or 1,000 instances of OPA. And so then the commercial product gives you that control plane that allows you to do things like author policy, distribute policy to all those OPAs, make sure that all the OPAs are healthy, record all the decisions that they're making. And so then overall, it really does aim to bring OPA and make it easy to use within an enterprise, not just for a single developer, but across many different teams.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. And one of the things that struck me is obviously you've come from academia by being kind of almost pulled through to the commercial world. I didn't see you kicking and screaming, so hopefully it wasn't too painful an experience. But Styra as an organization being 5 years old and only taken a 14 million in Series A funding is quite unusual. If I look at some of your some of the others who've been recognized in the containers trailblazers space. So I'm sure you will probably recognize the names of, for example, Aqua Security have just closed their Series E, which takes them with another $135 million to $265 million worth of investment. Bit of a difference in that, the similar length of time that those guys have been around as well, 265 million and 14 million. Yeah, that's a bit different. And then obviously we've looked at some others who have also been acquired. So for example, Karsten last year, who were runners up. I spoke to Niraj Tolia, one of the founders there. They were acquired by Veeam. Portworx were acquired by Pure Storage for 370 million. So, I think it would be interesting to see what happens to you guys over the next couple of years. I'm sure you won't be able to tell us too much, but hopefully we'll certainly be keeping an eye on things. So from that perspective, what do you feel you've learned from this? I mean, it's clearly if you've taken this level of investment, you've got a great VC partner with Accel. The money came in quite late in you're already 3 years into Styra at that time. You obviously have a lot of focus on your customers because, when push comes to shove, ultimately you need to pay the bills, you need to pay for the offices, or you did up until we got stuck in a pandemic where everybody's working from home. What have you learned about that? What's been your sort of takeaways and your advice to people? Because it's one of my big bugbears is that your most important investor is your client, your customers.
Right. So, there's learned quite a bit, right? I mean, I think for us, one of the interesting things was that we did spend quite a bit of time in the early days. Like the first part of the company's journey was focused on open source, making sure that project was successful and healthy, and it solved real problems. And so we spent a bunch of time in the very early days, not just building software, but working with our customers, as you say, having a very strong customer focus and saying, look, what problems do you need to solve? Can OPA solve them? And if it didn't, we would enhance OPA to make sure that that was successful. And then the second part of the journey of the company is really focusing on commercializing OPA. So making sure that commercial product that we provide is a great way of bringing OPA into the enterprise, solving a bunch of the challenges that come up in terms of deploying OPA within an enterprise. Now, what did we learn? I think we learned a bunch of things, and the biggest one to me is just, and if I had to give advice to folks, I would say, focus on solving real problems. I mean, it is amazing how easy it is, especially, I'm a technologist, so it's amazing that if you're not really focused on those end users, it's amazing how easy it would be to go off and build a bunch of software that people don't need. But so as long as you're, as you say, focused on those end customers, those end users, they will keep you doing the right thing. And so that's certainly one thing that we've seen be very, very successful. And then that sort of implies the second thing, which is that it is amazing how much time and energy it takes to go ahead and communicate the value of a project, a company, really anything to the world. And that is incredibly valuable. And I think that is something that especially technical founders will often undervalue, is that communication piece, going out, giving lots of talks, but even engaging with individuals or, small teams. And so those two things, making sure that you're solving real problems and making sure that you are communicating the value of what you do to the broader world is super crucial. And certainly things that I've seen work very, very well.
Oh, very good, very good. Well, it reminds me very much about because in the UK you could take double mathematics sort of at 18, and one is pure and one is applied. So I think the problem you find is a lot of people take a pure approach to technology, as in, what can we do, and versus the applied in what should we be actually trying to do that actually makes a difference for people.
Oh yeah, and I'll reiterate that. Like I know very well what the sort of pure approach looks like, right? At all those years I spent in academia, right? I know what that looks like. I also now know exactly what it takes in the more applied arena here, working in industry for the last several years.
Brilliant. And any other sort of takeaways? So you've talked about communicating, and obviously, your marketing team have put you forward for the awards, and you've clearly done very well. So congratulations again on that. What other things for you personally? Because, I don't know how much of a shift it was from your perspective over the last few years as you've been a startup founder versus an academic versus somebody who was in a bigger corporation.
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing to me is that if I compare sort of academics, open source, and even commercialization, I feel like there are just so many parallels there. Like so many of the skills that you develop when you're, in academia, you'll invent new whatever algorithms, but then and that's hard technical work. But then you've got to spend a lot of time explaining and communicating the value of that to the rest of the academia, right? Similarly, in open source, you build that piece of technology, and then you spend a whole bunch of time talking to people and explaining why it's useful and showing them why it's useful. And then commercialization feels the same way. It's just that communication piece is broken into marketing and sales, and so and the technology piece is broken into product and engineering. But there are these very common threads across all these different, seemingly very different environments. But in fact, I find that the skills you need to be successful are very, very similar in all three of those areas.
Interesting. Well, communications is obviously something that you're very good at. You present an awful lot about, what you guys are doing and in various guises, both on, the platform of places like the CNCF and others. What's coming next for you guys? You've achieved very impressive revenue growth over the last 12 months or so. I'm sure you haven't been doing too shabby prior to that either. What more can we be expecting to see from you guys?
Yeah, and maybe I'll just amplify that a little bit. Like I've been excited over the past, as you say, year to see that triple revenue growth and to see and that's great from a new customer point of view. But I also pay a lot of attention to our existing customers and making sure that the renewal rates are good and high, and they have been. I think it's like 90-95%, something like that. So that's been really great to see. And then the other thing that I'm always looking at is sort of like thinking about the future. This problem that we're looking at, authorization policy, is obviously something that those highly regulated industries like healthcare and finance care a lot about. They live and breathe it. Mm-hmm. But when I'm looking at the future, I'm also thinking about, well, do we focus there? Do we focus more broadly on other segments? And so it's been great to see that, like, if we looked at our current customer base, it's like 40% roughly of customers are not in highly regulated industries. So that's a coin flip as far as I'm concerned. And so from my point of view, looking to the future, what that implies is that this really is a pretty universal problem that we're looking at.
So there's not your regulatory pressure that's bringing those 40%. What do you think is the driver for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this notion of authorization policy is just pervasive, right? It has certainly security and compliance. There's certainly compliance and security policies that you need to put in place, but there's also a whole collection of just operational policies that just help the business run, or the development pipelines run the way they're intended to be. Like anybody who's using software in a team typically has to make decisions about how they're going to use software. And so those, if you just leave those sort of rules, those conventions to PDFs and to wikis, and you don't codify it in some way, shape, or form, then you're just trusting that everybody learns. So that, you're relying on people to learn what those rules are, to learn how to, create tickets in Jira correctly and fill out all the right fields or whatever it is. But if you put those rules and regulations into software in something like OPA and Styra, then you've got just better efficiencies across the spectrum in terms of how those enterprises work together to run and build their software. So there's this big operational component as well as sort of the security and compliance side.
Are you seeing that? Well, there's sort of like the supply chains are becoming more integrated as well, and perhaps that is an element within it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big trend that we see is just everything's getting automated, right? And
Sure.
so when you start thinking about automating everything, what you know is that you can't end up with certain pieces that are manual, right? If you've got a bunch of security checks that people have to perform before you, let's say, release a piece of software, then you can't go any faster than those people can do whatever checking they need to do. But if you take those same security checks that you typically have security or compliance or whoever do, and you automate them, then you can automate the whole thing, and you can obviously then start running software and deploying software more at the speed of minutes instead of months, which is the way I would.
Yeah, well, reducing that cycle is obviously going to be important as people want to stay competitive and agile, spreading that software development term into the wider organization, which I'm sure you're not adverse to. Any other things for you personally? I mean, where do you go? You've done this already. What else are we going to see from you guys or from you personally?
Well, yeah, I think as a company, the road is very clear ahead of us, right? Which is that we've got, tons and tons of OPA users. We've got, and we interact with them all the time. And so they can tell us exactly what else we need to do, as both for the open source project, as well as our commercial product. And so that to me is wonderful, right? Like, you're working with people, you're helping them solve problems. And oh, by the way, you're also figuring out exactly what you as a company need to do to really be successful. And so that's super exciting. For me, this is, the company is growing. We've grown quite a bit last year. I think it was like roughly 90%. So for me, it's been a lot of fun, and I expect it to be a lot of fun in the future to just see and work and with a growing company. And I think that'll be a lot of fun.
So you won't have met a lot of your colleagues then. What sort of size are we talking about for the team that you guys are leading at the moment?
Yeah, so we're right at 40 folks right now, and so it's we were obviously about 30 last year. So this is exciting. When you start growing 90% in a year, that's huge. So quite a bit of fun.
Cool. And are you all based in California, or bearing in mind it's over the last 12 months where it doesn't matter where anybody is anymore?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We were more focused in California before the last year, but we always wanted to get to a point where we were more distributed, just because I think it's overall better for the company. But now obviously we are all very distributed, but I think we've also taken this as an opportunity to become more of a remote first company, and so. And so we've been hiring more so all over the world. And I think that's been overall really, really good. And I expect that to continue.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Anything else you'd like to share that you've picked up along your adventure so far? I have one more question. Well, in fact, two questions, but carry on.
Anything else I'd like to share? I think I'm just pretty excited here. I mean, I think I'm the more I see OPA traction, the more I see, we're 1 million downloads a week or something at this point. So
wow.
The more I see that kind of traction and growth, the more excited I get about both the open source as well as our commercial offering, and just, really getting to solve the academic in me just really badly wants to solve that unified authorization problem and fundamentally provide like that new piece of software that people just typically aren't using today. Like, I always like to liken this to the database. Like today, everybody knows what a database is, and nobody thinks about building an application without a database. Well, I expect in the future that an authorization system will be very similar. People will think back, I don't know how far in the future it'll be. 20 years from now, they'll look back and they'll say, how did you ever, build and run software without this authorization system? So that's what I'm looking for.
Brilliant. So I have to ask you, this is my other question, because you've got this fantastic background there. So where does the name come from, Styra? Not Tim Heinrich, because I'd imagine that's got some Scandinavian element to it, because you've got the bit of the Viking look now with the beard and the long hair, and, you've got the horned helmet there in the background. So you're cutting that Viking vibe at the moment. But so where does Styra come from?
Yeah, so Styra is Nordic, and it means to govern.
Oh, okay. So there is a Viking theme, and it's not just a really nice logo that you thought of. Oh,
right.
Okay.
Yes. And then Timu's from that. Timu, remember, the co-founder is also from that area of the world. So,
where is he from?
Yeah, so he's from Sweden.
Okay. Yeah, so that's all, the whole Viking thing. So fantastic. That's really exciting. Cool. Well, that was my questions there.
I was going to say, the other bit of that is, of course, that Styro, the .com, was available when we came up with the name.
That always helps, doesn't it? Very important part is to check whatever amazing name you've come up with that somebody else hasn't nabbed all your digital assets online. So fantastic. Well, that's good to know. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time, Tim. Really, really appreciate it. It's been fascinating finding out about your adventure, both individually and as an organisation. And we're delighted that you've been able to come and spend some time with us, sharing a little bit of the Viking magic or the Nordic greatness that has come over through Styra, and obviously Californian now as well. Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. And I'm delighted that Tim Heinrichs, who is the CTO and co-founder of Styra, are Containers Trailblazer winner. And Tim himself was a runner-up in the Mail Tech Trailblazer of the Year last year. Thanks again, Tim. And everybody, if you would like to find out more about what we're doing, please do visit techtrailblazers.com. Follow us on Twitter at TechTrailblaze, or find us on LinkedIn as Tech Trailblazers. Thanks again, Tim. Very much appreciate that.
Thanks so much. It's been a ton of fun.